Hey everyone, it's Richard, watching The Plain Bagel. After months of negotiations and threats of escalations, this week we got the major update that the United States and the European Union have agreed to a trade deal. Something discussed between President Donald Trump and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen after an hour-long conversation at one of Trump's luxury golf courses in Western Scotland. Because of course it was. With the EU agreeing to a broad 15% tariff rate on exports to the United States, in addition to a number of other concessions. In fact, it's just the latest of seemingly one-sided trade deals to come out of the US, with the US seemingly flexing its size to not just get countries to agree to base-level tariffs, but also, again, to make other concessions in terms of investing money into the United States. So what gives? Well, we'll cover that in addition to the details of the deal, given that this is a pretty massive update. The EU, when you consider the group as one entity, does represent the US's largest trading partner, and together the two groups represent nearly a third of global trade and nearly 44% of global GDP, with even von der Leyen highlighting this as the largest trade deal ever. So what's actually been agreed to in this trade deal? Well, as mentioned, the European Union will now see a 15% levy on exports to the United States paid by US importers of European goods, which, while obviously an escalation, the 15% from the prior 10% tariff that was temporarily in place, is still half of what Donald Trump had threatened if the two entities didn't come to a trade deal, with Donald Trump having threatened 30% earlier in the month and the European Union preparing counter tariffs on $109 billion of US goods. However, while the 15% tariff is broad-based, there are a number of key exceptions here, including aircraft and aircraft parts, certain chemicals and generic drugs, semiconductor equipment, some agricultural products outside of so-called sensitive products like beef, rice, and poultry, natural resources, and critical raw materials, all of which will face zero tariffs under this agreement, with officials expecting more products to be added to this list in the future, demonstrating there were some wins for free trade here in certain key categories. Albeit some of these categories, even with this trade deal, do face the risk of tariffs in the near future, as we'll touch on later. Now, the trade deal does not eliminate the sector-specific tariffs, like, for example, steel and aluminum, which is currently set at 50%, but it's not additive, so the rate will still be 50%, not 65% with this new 15% rate. And it does reduce the automobile tariff from the current 27.5% tariff for automobiles and their parts to that broad 15% rate. Now, again, as mentioned, the EU has made a number of other concessions here in addition to that 15% rate, with the key ones being a promise to invest $600 billion in the US to purchase $750 billion worth of US energy products, namely liquefied natural gas and nuclear fuel over the next 3 years, and some somewhat hazy promises around buying US microchips, US military equipment, and opening EU markets more to US imports, with there being no dollar amounts or dates provided there. Now, at the surface level, those all sound like pretty big deals, right? We're talking about over $1 trillion worth of money here that the EU is seemingly promising the United States. However, despite these large figures, these are actually still considered the lesser concession in the face of the 15% broad tariff, because when it comes to the $600 billion investment, that doesn't appear to be an explicit promise, with officials highlighting after the fact that the government couldn't actually guarantee this amount would be invested in the US, given that it would come from private players, not the government, which is notably different from Japan's offer. In other words, the EU just expects that their companies will invest roughly $600 billion in the US, and when it comes to energy purchases, this likewise aligns with the bloc's geopolitical goals anyway. The area is trying to lower its dependence on Russian oil and gas, given the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And the bloc has already considered phasing out all Russian energy imports by 2028. Meaning this is something that might have naturally arrived anyway. Obviously, there are other energy markets worth considering, but goes to show that the 15% tariff rate is really the big concession here, with von der Leyen highlighting that this rate was, quote, the best we could get. Now, importantly, there are some key details in areas where details still need to be fleshed out. Wine and spirits being one important one, a big export category for the European Union, where no agreement has yet been made in terms of whether that category will see tariffs and at what rate. And while steel and aluminum will continue to see the 50% tariff in the meantime, the two groups have discussed the possibility of replacing this tariff with a quota system that would simply restrict the quantity of steel and aluminum that can be traded. But that is the trade deal as it exists, and a very important one for both groups. Again, when you group the countries in the EU, the entity represents the largest merchandise trade deficit faced by the United States outside of China, with the country importing $236 billion more of goods from the EU than it sends to the country as of 2024. Albeit, again, a bit of a false comparison given that we're talking about a group of countries, and the deficit would be roughly $100 billion less if you included services. Now, there are some social media posts circulating highlighting that the 15% tariff is quote, fair, given that the EU generally charges a value-added tax at a comparable rate, though the actual rate varies by country. That's not really a sound argument, given that the value-added tax is charged on all products sold, not just US imports. Nonetheless, this could very well help Donald Trump achieve his objective of reducing the trade deficit that the US has with the European Union. While not all is lost on the EU side, the tariff-free categories are fairly important to the bloc. You see, while they import a good chunk of so-called primary goods, namely oil and other energy from the US, they are large pharmaceutical and automobile exporters, both of which will have lower, if not 0% tariffs now. And it makes sense why the US has backed off of tariffs around pharmaceuticals, given that the EU supplies roughly a fifth of total active pharmaceutical ingredients needed by the US and single-handedly provides 43% of branded active pharmaceutical ingredients. However, even with these breaks, the EU will still take an impact to their economy here, with the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, for example, highlighting that this will still have a negative impact on the industry. Which brings us back to the question: why would the EU agree to this? Is it really just that the US had the cards here? Well, that is definitely part of it. The US does have a strong negotiation position. The EU does export more to the US than it imports, albeit the dependence on each other for trade is much more balanced than countries like Canada, with 21% of exports going to the US and representing around 3% of the EU's GDP, versus the US, where 17.8% of exports go to the EU, representing around 1% of GDP. And while the 15% tariff is far from the 0 for 0 goal pitched by the EU earlier, it does nonetheless provide the bloc much needed stability and predictability, as highlighted by von der Leyen herself, which will help ease investor concerns and allow companies to plan more for the future. Auto manufacturers in Europe, for example, have been reporting billions of dollars in losses and issuing profit warnings as a result of the higher nearly 30% tariff. So while still far from the goal, the 15% rate is still a big relief for the space. However, there is a consideration that this move is intended to try and foster a more productive and better starting point for negotiations with the US, to set a sort of baseline to allow for further discussions around maybe expanding the tariff-free products, as officials seem to be expecting, without seeing the type of escalation that countries like China have seen firsthand. And the EU does maintain some non-tariff barriers here. For example, there are tighter regulations around food, which sort of bars US exports to the EU for certain categories. And while the two have highlighted that there will be discussions in that area, we haven't seen any explicit concessions there. However, there is an interesting argument circulating that even with this 15% tariff, automobile manufacturers, for example, may still have a bit of an edge over US domestic producers, with this being thanks to the country's other tariffs. You see, steel and aluminum represent roughly 65% of a car's components, with these components currently facing a 50% tariff to bring into the United States for domestic manufacturing purposes. And while the goal is obviously to have supply chains focus more on domestic production, currently, US manufacturers still send and receive many car parts across the border to Canada and Mexico, for example, all of which is going to drive the price up of domestically produced vehicles until all of those functions are onshored, versus the European Union, which can manufacture a car tariff-free with other trade partners and then export to the United States for this flat 15% rate. Now, it is hard to quantify that comparison on a per vehicle basis. Many manufacturers do rely on domestic produced metals. It's hard to price out how every individual component will contribute to the price per vehicle, and many producers often contract out their prices for years into the future, so there's not often an immediate impact from tariffs. Nonetheless, it is feasible that EU cars sold with a 15% tariff may still be competitive. However, on the net, the US still benefits from this trade deal, with the agreement being criticized by some EU members, including Germany and France, after its announcement. And if the whole arrangement is truly to try and balance out trade, then there might be hope here that if things normalize, that the two areas can once again discuss tariff-free trade. Now, while this has been viewed as a breakthrough in the global trade war that's been going on, it's worth highlighting that there are still many hurdles up ahead. For example, the European Union member states still have to approve any trade deal, which might prove difficult, especially given that the terms of the arrangement go against the World Trade Organization, which the European Union is a part of. We also don't yet have a written out and signed agreement here, and we've already started to see some departures in terms of how each side is interpreting the agreement that was reached. So there's still room for road bumps as the details are fleshed out. And there is room for further tariff escalations under this arrangement, with the US currently carrying out Section 232 investigations into a number of key categories, including timber, copper, semiconductors, and notably pharmaceuticals, with Section 232 referring to the part of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 that gives the president the power to impose tariffs for national security risks, with this being the same law evoked for the steel and aluminum tariffs. And it's expected that these investigations will likely result in more sector-specific tariffs that will apply even in this EU trade deal. Albeit under this arrangement, they would not exceed the 15% broad rate. But that is where we are today, the latest trade deal announced by the United States, following the likes of deals coming from the UK, Japan, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and likely to be followed by other announcements this week, given Donald Trump's August 1st deadline. Anyway, that's the video. A quick update on the trade deal announced. If you found it helpful, please do make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does help the channel tremendously. And thanks again for joining, and I'll likely see you later this week as we get an update around Canada and how we play a role in all this, for better or for worse. See you then.